today we are going to be talking about the Minot Air Force Base Mike-6 Minuteman launch site incident that took place on October 24th through 25th. It was take place over the night in 1966 near Carpio or Granito, North Dakota. Now, this is not the more famous Minot site that incident that took place in October 1968 that people have probably heard me mention a lot. So keep that in mind. This took place almost 2 years earlier in North Dakota. Now, during the 1950s, the Cold War was heating up, and American military leaders feared the possible threat of a northern attack over the Arctic by enemy bomber planes. Recognizing this threat, they sought to find possible sites for radar stations and military bases in the northern tier states bordering Canada. And if people have heard of the Northern Tier incidents, it's a set of other sites around incidents around missile sites that happened in 1975 in kind of these northern states bordering Canada. And one of these long-range defense radar stations, constructed as part of the Air Defense Command's permanent network, was established south of Minot, North Dakota, in May 1951. Minot Air Force Station was actually the first major Air Force installation in North Dakota, predating the two larger bases, Minot Air Force Base and the Grand Forks Air Force Base. Now, in 1954, the city of Minot sold the Air Force on becoming the site for a new fighter interceptor base. The following year, the local businessmen and citizens would donate $50,000 to buy the initial land for the base, and construction of the new facility would begin in May 1956. Officially activated as a base on January 10th, 1957, Minot Air Force Base became an Air Defense Command base until the first permanent Strategic Air Command unit was activated there in 1958. In 1961, the Air Force selected the land around Minot for a new Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missile complex. Construction of the missile sites commenced in January 1962, and by July, command of Minot Air Force Base had passed from the Air Defense Command to the Strategic Air Command, as the base's primary mission changed from becoming an air defense station to strategic deterrence. Now, the Strategic Air Command activated the 455th Strategic Missile Wing in November 1962. This wing would later be renamed and redesignated the 91st Strategic Missile Wing in June of 1968. So in later cases, like the later Minot cases, they talk about the 91st Missile Wing. It's essentially the same wing. It was just renamed. Now, in less than a year, on September 9th, 1963, the very first Minuteman I missiles arrived from Hill Air Force Base in Utah. Within 28 months, in April 1964, the 455th became combat ready. The fields in North Dakota were now implanted with over 150 silos, 10 launch complexes spread out over 12,000 square miles, ready to defend this country with a nuclear response if necessary. Now, an interesting side note, I guess, is that the Amtrak, when Amtrak, the train used to stop through the town, the conductor used to give them a little bit of history, and he would tell people that if North Dakota succeeded from the Union, it would become the third largest nuclear power in the world. They would have they'd be basically like right behind the U.S. and Russia for nuclear weapons because North Dakota has so many nuclear weapons and silos there. Not only do they have all these silos, Minot Air Force Base is not just one part of the nuclear triad. The nuclear triad, if people are not familiar, is you've got your ICBMs, you've got your nuclear submarines, and you've got your strategic nuclear bombers. And Minot basically is two parts of the nuclear triad. Not only do they have this very large intercontinental ballistic missile facility fields, they also were home base to B-52 nuclear strategic bombers. And so they basically had two parts of the nuclear triad going on in Minot. And it was one of the larger bases, actually. So many people and stuff worked in the Minot Air Force Base area. Out of all 49 Strategic Air Command bases, it was one of the largest in the United States. Now, to kind of get onto our actual some background for you for the area, this Mike-6 incident took place about 7 months before the more famous Malmstrom Air Force Base shutdown case. That would be the Echo incident on March 16th, or if you believe the Robert Salas story, on March 24th. We'll get into that later. But this event happened about 7 months before that, and it's another incident involving a Minuteman missile system adversely affected during what was a radar visual sighting of a UFO in the missile fields in Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. This August 24th through August 25th, 1966 case is documented in the Air Force Project Blue Book files and was investigated by Project Blue Book investigator J. Allen Hynek. He would later popularize the case in a December 1966 article titled "Are UFOs Real?" in the Saturday Evening Press. It was also investigated by Robert Lowe, Condon Committee Project Coordinator, who was involved in investigating the last case I did, the Alvin Moore case. He investigated this case with Hynek, and this case would be listed as Case 9 in the Condon Project's final report. In fact, in the Blue Book documents, it was suggested that this case could be the case that kind of kicks off the Condon Project's, investigation into the topic. And I don't know if that was specifically the case or not, but it was Case 9 in the final report. But unlike other missile incidents, this one does not involve the shutdown of any nuclear missiles. In this incident, communications between a launch control facility, otherwise known as an LCF, and those nowadays are called MAFs, missile alert facilities. They changed the terminology, and I believe 1992, in the 90s anyways. But there's a launch control facility, or the MAF, and the base command post, and there was static between the mobile strike alert team sent to investigate the UFO and the flight security controller at the LCF. And so the communications were apparently interrupted by static. Now, like many sightings that take place over these missile fields, this case actually takes place over an abnormally long period of time, approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. And it involves multiple observers at widely separated distances and sites, with supposed confirmation by multiple radar systems. Now, on August 24th, this is the night, at 10 p.m., Airman 3rd Class Michael D. Mueller of the 862nd Combat Support Squadron is walking his post at the missile site Mike-6, which is the launch flights Mike-6. Those are the unmanned launch facilities that are underground with the actual missiles. And these security patrols, basically secure the area. And so he's out walking on his post when he witnesses a luminous shape about 45 degrees elevation in the northern sky. Now, the other guy that with him says 40 degrees, and that it actually varied between 0 degrees and 55 degrees. But so this object he sees exhibits limited lateral motion, and it always seems to come back to its original position. The object continually changed color from green to red to blue in turn. It seemed dim in relation to the stars. The guard, frightened, wakes his partner, Airman 3rd Class John M. Turner, who is due to relieve him in about an hour's time at about 11 p.m. They both watch the object for a while. Now, very few witnesses were able to actually discern any distinct shape to the object. Airman Turner had reported that when the object had moved in front of the cloud, he could see the changing colored lights, and they appeared to come from behind the object, and they kind of reflected against these clouds, created a silhouette. And he described the object as being round on top and bottom. A sketch of this object was drawn by Turner and is included in the Air Force files, and you can see it kind of on the slide here. Now, meanwhile, their captain, who they reported the site to over the base radio, sends out a strike team to the Mike-6 site and alerts the South Base radar crew, which is the Minot Air Force Station. By the time the strike team reached Mike-6 at about 11:20 p.m., and this is approximate, the problem we have with kind of reconstructing the timeline is we only kind of have approximate dates from the log of when these people showed up at the various times. We don't have like down to the minute or accurate sighting times for the actual when they saw the objects, etc. But the strike team basically arrives at 11:20 p.m. and the original object supposedly is gone. They don't see it. However, they and several other men notice one or more yellowish white objects very low on the southeastern horizon. in the direction of the airstrip of Minot Air Force Base. That's roughly 50 miles in the distance. Now, reports do state that actually, so this strike team was led by this guy, Airman Second Class Holiday, and he supposedly briefly did actually see that first object that was seen by Mueller and Turner. So when he was driving to the site in their Jeep or whatever their control vehicle, security vehicle they were using at the time, they were watching a white light, the white light, as they approached the site. They could not see this, what was referred to as an unusually bright object that Mueller and Turner saw. Turner would point it out to Holiday when they arrived, who apparently did briefly see it at about 20 degrees elevation, not 45 or 40, but only about 20 degrees elevation, before he went back to returning to watch the white light again. He would later briefly try to find that first light again that Turner and Mueller saw, but he could not see it and returned to looking at the white light. The guys that were with him, his rider, Airman Third Class Aldrich, did not see the first object at all. He only heard Mueller, Turner, and that Holiday kind of briefly mentioned it. And that's kind of thing is like some of the people that were out there didn't even see these alleged objects, so they only saw the one object at the time. And this is kind of it's a later photo of a security crew kind of from Warren Air Force Base, but these are kind of the security alert teams, and they kind of patrol the area. Now, roughly at the same time, the security squadron arrives out there and they see these white objects. The 786th Radar Squadron reports that the base radar detects the objects 95 miles out on their search radar and at about 100,000 feet altitude. The object appears to be larger than a B-52. Now, I'll point out this 100,000 feet thing is mentioned in multiple places and a lot of the literature about the case. And it is mentioned like once in the AFR 200-2 report, but it kind of contradicts what the radar logs later say. The radar logs say that they don't actually have, that they only assumed the object that was that high. And when the base contacted South Base in order to kind of get a track on, to figure out the height of the target, they were informed that the radar doesn't actually work at that height, and they couldn't tell them a height at that target. So I'm not sure that it ever really was tracked at 100,000 feet. At least it wasn't by the South Base radar as implied. But so as this thing is being tracked, rising and descending a number of times, it actually supposedly it rises between 2,000 to 8,000 feet. And as it's doing this, each time Major Chester A. Shaw, who's in charge of the Mike-6 missile crew, finds his radio transmissions are being interrupted by static, even though he's 60 feet underground in one of these launch kind of control consoles. And to kind of get a better idea of how these radar systems work out there, they're basically using what's called kind of two-dimensional radar, not three-dimensional radar. So they had two different systems they would have to use in conjunction. They used what was called a search radar. And a search radar was essentially like a fence. It would look out in all 360 directions, and it could tell you the direction it picks up a target, and it could tell you a distance, but it couldn't tell you a height or any of that other information. So they would use that in combination with what's called a height finder radar. Now, a height finder radar, and this base was specifically using what was called the AN FPS 90, which is actually an updated version of an older radar called the FPS 6. And these height finder radars is once you have an azimuth, a direction that you know this target is coming, they target this height finder radar. And these are kind of what were referred to as nodding radars. They would basically mechanically nod up and down at that azimuth, looking for a target to try and figure out the height of it. And they would plot it on what was called a range height indicator plot, which essentially on the x-axis had the distance from the radar set, and on the y-axis had the height. And you would get a little plot there, and they could put a cursor on it, and it would give them a readout of the height. And in combination with what they got from the search radar, they could kind of figure out a three-dimensional coordinate of the direction and the height and range to these targets. And this is essentially what the scopes look like. That's actually an older model than they would have used. That would have been used like with an FPS 6. On the left there with your standard kind of range height indicator. And on the right is perhaps the more recognizable, what's called a PPI, plan position indicator plot. And that's basically your 360 sweep that you see that goes around in circles, and you see the little blops or blips kind of pick up on it. Now, so more specifically, what happened is South Base had been called saying, hey, we're picking up this target at 95 miles at about 357 degrees azimuth. Can you tell us the height? They pick up the target at about 355 degrees azimuth, 95 miles, and they pick up this height at about 2,400 feet. Later, they pick it up at about 4,400 feet, and it changes altitude every so often. It was observed going, like I said, between 2,400 feet and 8,200 feet altitude, but it didn't vary in azimuth by more than a degree or two. And the range of 95 miles per hour never changed. It was always at 95 miles per hour, always in the same direction. So this object was essentially hovering in the same place, except for the radar showing it changing in altitude a little bit. But unlike the 100,000 feet, their radar only ever picked it up from 2,400 to about 8,000 something feet. Now, at this time, as the strike team reports the UFO begins to kind of swoop and dive, and it appears to land about 10 to 15 miles south of Mike-6. And elsewhere in the literature, it says south of November 7th. Technically, they're sort of like next to each other, so depending on where it was, it could be both, I guess. But they see it land about 10 to 15 miles away from where they are at Mike-6. And they witness a glow from the area where the object appears to be. Now, Mike-6 site control sends a strike team to check on it. And when they get within 10 miles of the site, static interrupts their radio contact back with base. And 5 to 8 minutes later, the glow diminishes and the UFO takes off. Now, these two photos here, this is kind of the layout here of a base. This underground facility is what's called the launch control capsule. And this is where the missile officers are underground, roughly 60 to 80 feet or whatever underground. Above that is what's called the launch control support building that provides support to the people that are below ground. And this is a photo of the Mike-1 facility that they were located at. And this isn't the Mike-1 Launch Control Center, but it's just a generic image of what these underground capsules look like that they were stationed in for, I believe, 24 hours at a time. They had a 24-hour kind of like duty that they were stuck down there in these capsules underground. And so this guy is underground, and he's getting static between him and the strike team that he sent out to investigate this site, investigate this glowing object that they saw potentially land. Now, at this time, another UFO is sighted by personnel, I believe the Mike-4 launch facility, and it's also tracked on radar. The first object flies underneath the second one, and the two objects disappear separately. Now, the radar log actually reports that the white object went underneath the first object. So I don't know if they just kind of flipped that around, but it's kind of reported differently in different places. But basically, two of the objects, one object supposedly went under the other, and then they disappeared, one to the north, one to the south. Now, at 12:19 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the very first sighting, an F-106 interceptor was sent up by the 5th Fighter Interceptor Squadron out of Minot Air Force Base. The pilot of the fighter, his name was Captain Berg, was sent to intercept the radar target, and he reported, reported that while he was guided by the radar crew, in this case, Staff Sergeant Angel Kamako and Airman First Class Adele, guided him to this target using the search and height finder radars. Adele was running the height finder radar, and Kamako was running the search radar. And they targeted him in on this target. And he flew in on this target, and he flew over the target at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000 feet. So if you recall, the radar targets they were picking up, they saw this object kind of like at these different 1,000 feet elevations. And so they send this guy out, and he flies in circular patterns at all these different elevations trying to pick up the target. Unfortunately, and while the radar verified the plane passed through essentially or very near the target, the pilot made no visual contact. So looking on this radar plot, it was what I believe is called a merge plot. Like you could not really distinguish between their plane they were tracking and where this object was. So it was on the radar right over, essentially right where this target is supposed to be. But the pilot could not find anything. Not only could he not see it visually, the plane, these planes back in the day, they were equipped with radar and infrared detection equipment, and they picked up no contact in the area as well. So the control tower asked the aircraft commander of a KC-135 Stratotanker, a refueler that was flying the area, to check to see if he could see anything in the area, but they reported nothing as well. So the interceptors could find nothing when they went out there, even though they were where it happened. Supposedly it was picked up on radar, where radar was still showing it. There was nothing there to be seen. Now, this is kind of, I don't know of it. I guess maybe the GIF animation does not play. But that's, again, kind of a standard radar plane indicator. And Agent Kamako kind of drew this diagram here of what his radar scope looked like. And as you can see, the center dot is where the radar station is. That first kind of circle is a 100-mile range. And you recall they kind of picked up this target at about 95 miles. That kind of dot where I put a red circle where the UFO supposedly is. The plane takes off from this other dot. That's Minot Air Force Base, which is north of where the actual radar station is. So that's why it's not the same dot as the main center. And the plane's track kind of flies out there, and he flies these it's hard to see, but he flies these loop-de-loops around at all these different altitudes to try to see it. Search radar operator Kamako reports that this target remains continuously on his radar until he's relieved at 3 a.m. in the morning. So it's on there all night long, apparently. And except when the fighter was sent out, it was an isolated target. No other aircraft, ground clutter, or noise pips were seen within 20 miles of this target at any point during the night. This entire episode lasts about 4 hours, and it's confirmed by two other missile launch sites, Mike-4 and November 7 near Mohall. And there are several witnesses. Unfortunately, supposedly there's witness statements somewhere. They're not actually in the Blue Book files I've seen. So I just have quotes I've got from other sources, and just want to kind of just list some of the general descriptions. Some of these other witnesses at the site kind of described the incident. The descriptions of the object were as followed. One of them described it as red, greenish, yellow, white, multicolored object, changing colors from red to green to bright yellow. Another said it was red, green, yellow lights. And the guy said large white yellow ball with red on one side and green on another. Another witness stated stationary light changes from green to orange to red, or a bright green light with a flashing red or green light around it. The apparent size of the object would appear to correlate with the change in color and the intensities that were witnessed. When the object was a white or yellow-white color, it would glow in intensity and appear to be very large. When it was a red or kind of a green color, it would glow dimly and appeared very small. In fact, many of the people that were, when they reported these objects kind of dimming or going out, is when they were kind of reddish colored. These objects also seem to follow a similar pattern of movement described by the various witnesses. One witness reported that the object would brighten, move laterally a bit, then dim, move downward, disappear, reappear, and then repeat in this sequence. Another witness reported the object would increase in brightness, move, then hover, go dim, then go out, then reappear, then repeat the sequence. Others reported it basically just a glowing hovering object that would change colors and intensity and then dim and go out. So Project Blue Book and the Condon Project essentially come to the same conclusion, and it's a conclusion I mostly agree with, that the initial radar targets and the white objects seen were just the aircraft coming in at the base. And they did get kind of a list of some flights coming in. And because we don't have exact times when the strike team saw these white lights, it's hard to match up exactly, but there were some flights that came in roughly in the same time period that these people could have been seen. And if you recall, these white lights were seen directly in the direction of the landing path of the Minot Air Force Base in the distance, and that they reported you could see planes that would come in on that path from those sites. And so they figured that those white lights were just some of these planes that were coming in, and the radar targets were either the planes or anomalous propagation, and the fact that the targets were always in the same 95-mile range, kind of like way out there, and they didn't seem to do anything. They figured that was just kind of a radar propagation issue going on. Now, the multicolored object that kind of kicked things off and initially started the sighting would be nothing more than a star. And the Condon report suggests that it could be Capella, but they do point out that if the guy's estimates that it was at 45 degrees elevation is accurate, it couldn't be Capella. But as we saw, the other guy said 40 at one point. When he pointed out the other guy was only at 20-degree elevation. So we can't really take his elevation estimates as that accurate. If it's not Capella, I still think that was almost certainly a star twinkling, and people were suffering the effects of autokinesis. If you look at those descriptions, the general descriptions I just gave you, that's textbook definition of people witnessing a star and experiencing autokinesis. Because when you stare at a star in the sky like that, and with no other background, it can appear to bob and kind of move around a little bit laterally, left and right, up and down. And it's pretty textbook star kind of sighting going on. And they concluded, both Blue Book in their kind of initial report and the Condon Project, is that like is known to happen in multiple witness sightings. The kind of excitement of one sighting sets off a group of others as people get overexcited and endow undue significance to prosaic objects that perhaps would not normally grab their attention. Now, this case did actually get a little bit of publicity. It was first published actually in the not Hynek's article, but in the Minot Daily News in December 6, 1966, in an article called Minot Launch Control Center Saucer Cited as One Indication of Outer Space Visitors. Now, they actually got the story because they referenced the Saturday Evening Post article, even though it hadn't come out yet. They had heard it was going to be published, and they went and asked the Air Force for confirmation of the story, and printed this article a little bit before Hynek's article came out. And Hynek, of course, would kind of bring the case to most people's attention in his article, Are Flying Saucers Real?, published in the Saturday Evening Post on December 30th, 1966. And he would open up the article with this case, where he gives a description pretty similar to what I just gave you guys. He says, on August 25th, 1966, an Air Force officer in charge of a missile crew in South Dakota suddenly found that his radio transmission was being interrupted by static. At the time, he was sheltered in a concrete capsule 60 feet below the ground. While he was trying to clear up the problem, other Air Force personnel on the surface reported seeing a UFO, an unidentified flying object, high in the sky. It had a bright red light, and it appeared to be alternately climbing and descending. Simultaneously, a radar crew on the ground picked up the UFO at 100,000 feet. So begins a truly puzzling UFO report, one that is not explainable as it now stands as such familiar cases as a balloon, aircraft, satellite, or meteor. When the UFO climbed, the static stopped, stated the report made by the base's director of operations. The UFO began to swoop and dive, and it appeared to land 10 to 15 miles south of the area. Missile Site Control sent a strike team, well-armed Air Force guards, to check. When the team was about 10 miles from the landing site, static disrupted radio contact with them. 5 to 8 minutes later, the glow diminished, and the UFO took off. Another UFO was visually sighted and confirmed by radar. The one that was first sighted passed beneath the second. Radar also confirmed this. This made for altitude towards the north, and the second seemed to disappear with the glow of red. This incident was not picked up by the press, as is typical is typical of puzzling cases that I've studied during my 18 years I've served with the Air Force's scientific consultant on the problem of UFOs. So he publishes the case in that, and that kind of, brings it to most people's attention. And this is one of the few cases where we actually have like blue book files, like on one of these. A lot of these cases, we don't actually have any files or investigation, honestly, because they probably never actually happened. But I guess we'll talk about that a bit later. Raymond Fowler would kind of add on to this case and add a little bit more detail when an article would be published in the Christian Science Monitor in December 1973, titled "Air Force Sternly Denies the UFO Minuteman Incident." Now, he actually got in a little bit of trouble with his employer for this article that he was interviewed for. They kind of were mad and felt he was talking out of turn, and I guess even threatened to fire him at one point anyways. But Raymond Fowler was a project supervisor for Sylvania Corporation on a Minuteman missile program near Boston. And he was also chairman of the Massachusetts subcommittee of the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, NICAP. And is a pretty well-known UFO investigator, well-known for bringing kind of the Kingman case. A lot of cases he was kind of like the main guy on. And he wrote several books, UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors, Case of UFO Investigator, UFO Testament. Pretty well-known UFO guy. And while he was working for Sylvania, he kind of had the opportunity to speak to some colleagues and military personnel who worked and manned these Minuteman sites in North Dakota and Montana, who would sometimes feed him UFO reports kind of related to incidents. And one of these Air Force officers that he had spoke to when he was working at Sylvania, now he tries to keep everyone anonymous, but it's been so many years. I'm just going to say the guy's name, Captain Hathaway, because I have his letter where he told people it anyways. So this guy, Captain Hathaway, was supposedly one of these Air Force officers in the launch control facility during this Mike-6 incident on October 25th, 1966. And they report mostly the kind of same story as we've already heard, but they kind of add some more details and get almost a bit more kind of conspiratorial about it. They report again that the officer declared that the launch control facility's radar equipment, which enabled them to receive fire instructions from coordinated centers and transmit them to the silo launch facilities, was blocked out by static when the UFO hovered directly over it. So not too different what we already know. But this guy goes on to say that there's nothing he can conceive of on Earth that could cause the equipment to malfunction from such an altitude, emphasizing that it was working perfectly beforehand and it worked fine afterwards. Again, the only problem with that is that this object wasn't at such an altitude. It wasn't ever directly over the launch facilities. So, and from all things I've read, it's actually and countless other cases I've seen, it's not that uncommon for this static to happen. I mean, I found several cases where they've had static issues like this. But he also added a little bit more on the case. He says he was told that not only was the static interrupted between the strike teams who were dispatched to look at this spot, but the aircraft, these intercepting aircraft, and he implies there's more than one of them. Instead of just this one F-106, there's like more than one of them. Two of them, I believe I read somewhere else. And their radars were jammed and interfered, and they couldn't be communicated with as well, which is nonsense, to be honest. Like, we've got the radar logs of the interceptor and the interceptor statements. Like, there was no break in communication. There was no jamming of the radio of the airplanes. And this guy would also tell Fowler that the Air Force supposedly swooped in and silenced everyone. And, people signed NDAs, told to be quiet, never talk about this, etc. And again, as we know, this is utter nonsense. This case was in the Blue Book files. It was published in the newspaper a couple of months later. People were talking about it. In fact, if you listen to some of Robert Hastings' kind of witnesses that have come forward, at this time in Minot, UFOs were such a talking point that the security guards would literally set up chairs on the roof of the building or out front to look for UFOs, and that they talked about these UFOs all the time. So this incident was never silenced. There was never any NDAs. And this guy, I don't know. The problem with Fowler is he presents a lot of stories, usually anonymously, usually with no way to document and back them up. And many times the story, he just does not like really critically look at them or examine the evidence. So you've got to take what Fowler says and reports with a big grain of salt, and his missile stories with a big grain of salt. Now, there was one other sighting, just I'm going to wrap up here, basically the week earlier in Donnybrook. Now, Donnybrook is to the west of Mike-6. It's real close. In fact, I think it's closer than some of these other missile sites are. And this case involves Border Patrol agent Flickinger, Donald E. Flickinger, who is perhaps more well known to some people for his involvement in cattle mutilation investigations. He was well known for investigating the kind of connection to the supposed satanic rituals related to cattle mutilations, involved with the Bankston letters, or what's called the Son of Satan kind of letters, an incident where the guy that was in prison supposedly wrote a letter kind of informing them that these cattle mutilations were being done by satanic groups. And he was involved with that, but he had actually, that wasn't until the 70s when Hynek asked him to get involved with cattle mutilations. He actually had his own sighting, which I reported before, here in Washington State near the border back in 1965. And that kind of set him on this kind of path of being interested in UFOs. He would become NICAP's kind of North Dakota subcommittee kind of leader, and would investigate hundreds of UFO cases in the 60s and 70s throughout the Dakotas. But he also had his own kind of famous case, a classic case that was investigated by the Condon Committee as well, and was included in one of Hynek's books. And this happened on August 19th, 1966 in Donnybrook. And he's in the process of taking 2 prisoners back to Canada. And supposedly, as he's taking these prisoners back, he sees a silver dome disc kind of floating down the side of a hill near Donnybrook, North Dakota, about 10 feet off the ground. Now, it moves across the valley and climbs to about 100 feet, hovers over a reservoir, and then appears to land about kind of 250 feet away. This object then tilts on its edge, rises into the clouds at a high speed. Flickinger then later finds odd indentations in the field in the form of a triangle, size 10 feet. Some stones also seem to have been moved recently. Now, the Condon Project and investigators kind of believe these stones were just moved by animals, and we're not really too impressed with the indentations. But this famous sighting did happen in the area kind of the week before, and it's one of the only kind of UFO sightings at that time in the Blue Book files outside of this Minot kind of case here. Now, there are some other cases kind of in the area. There is a case that was reported in this from Richard Hall's The UFO Evidence, Volume 2, of a case that supposedly happened on March 5th, 1967, so several months later. And this is just a little over a week and a half before this Malmstrom case is supposed to happen. And as they say, on March 5th, 1967, Air Defense Command radar tracked an unidentified target descending over a Minuteman missile silo of the 91st Strategic Missile Wing at Minot Air Force Base. Base security teams quickly converged on the area and saw a metallic disc-shaped craft ringed with bright flashing lights moving slowly. The disc stopped and hovered 500 feet off the ground. As security police held their fire and watched in awe, suddenly the object began moving again and circled directly over the launch control facility. F-106 fighter interceptors were standing still on the flight line, waiting impatiently for an order from NORAD to scramble. When the order was not forthcoming, base operations decided on their own to scramble the interceptors. At that moment, the UFO climbed straight up and away at an incredible streak of speed. Now, unfortunately, like with this case, the source on it is none other than Raymond Fowler in his book, Casebook of a UFO Investigator. And we don't know any names or any other details, and there's actually no case that happened on this date in the files anywhere. I believe the nearest UFO case was like 2 or 3 days earlier, kind of near Mohala or Velva. So again, there's no evidence this case happened. We got no records for it. And if you look at it, it seems fairly similar to the case we just talked about, with just some more extraordinary details about, almost firing on it. But they sent out the F-106 planes. Only this time, instead of not finding it, it evades the planes at high speed. And this isn't actually the kind of only story from the area, from the time period. There's another very similar story. There's a story told by a guy named David Shore, and he doesn't remember the exact dates either. He just says it's 1966, 1967. Again, very, very kind of similar, only in this case, supposedly the missiles got a launch in progress indicator saying that they were going to go off. But apparently there's an error, and then it didn't happen. There's another case with a guy named David Schindel that's quite well known. Again, he believes his case happened in September 1966. Now, and I thought for the longest time that he was just confusing perhaps this August 25th case, because they're fairly similar, except for in his case, he says some missiles got shut down. And I would have thought they were the exact same case, only apparently I found references that there were Blue Book files for a sighting on September 15th, 1966, which is when his case has been tentatively dated by various listings. The only problem is those alleged files aren't actually in the Blue Book files that I can find anywhere, so I have not been able to see them. But his case happened just shortly after this, if it wasn't this case. But the weird thing is, David Schindel was assigned a Mike flight. He would have actually been one of the Air Force officers at this flight during this October 25th incident. So it's very odd to me that he doesn't seem to, he mentions this case now, but he didn't seem to remember it like originally. And even Robert Hastings is a little like confusing on whether or not they're the same cases. In fact, on his website, he implies the case we just talked about, this October 25th case, could be Schindel's case. Like, we just don't really know, because Schindel, like a lot of these guys, don't actually have any documents or evidence to support their cases. They just remembered them 30, 40 years later after hearing some of these other kind of stories. So there's a lot of stories kind of around this time period. This is one of the only cases where we actually have the documentation to say it actually happened. And I have a feeling some of these other people are kind of just remembering some of these cases that did happen and are adding some of these more fantastical elements onto it later on, because of bad memory 30, 40 years later. And that's why there's no evidence of their cases happening when they believe they happened. But there are cases that are similar, just not quite as amazing, that happened around the same time period, that I think that's what they're kind of confabulating from. But again, it's hard to say because we don't have documents from any of this stuff.